Happy to bring on Cole Thompson here. He's our returning C.I.A. person from the Texans here. He works for the Texans Wire, does some great stuff for the SEC as well, and want his review of the game. So, what'd you think of that game? Obviously, the Texans came out on top, but what stuck out to you here?
Yeah, Ryan, if I'm going to be completely honest, there wasn't really much to go into. A lot of the starters were resting. I took more away from the joint practices because that was a good litmus test. And even D'Amico Ryan said, we get to stack up where we are as a unit against one of the best teams in the NFL. I know that was a very big testament of what Dan Campbell said about the future of the Texans organization. That's more so what took away this past week in the joint practice. A couple things that I will say for the Texans side. They feel really good about the wide receiver room in terms of depth. They're going to have some players that are probably cut that they plan on bringing back to the practice squad. Cornell Powell has got to be a name. He had 6 catches for 53 yards. Quintez Cephas made a really nice touchdown grab at the end of the first half. You also feel really good about maybe a guy in Daniel Jackson, the former Minnesota undrafted wide receiver that could eventually be at least that 7th man. Jared Wayne spent 3 years on the practice squad before finally getting his opportunity. I think that you could see something very similar to that with a guy in Daniel Jackson if they want to keep him around. I think it made a couple of easier cuts on paper. You look at the D'Angelo Ross move. This is a player who had a very underwhelming camp. He had a very underwhelming end to last season. They brought him back as a special teamer. He hasn't been impressive on special teams. There's been other guys who have stepped on up. It does feel like the writing is on the wall for him to not be back with the organization capacity. And then, of course, there are some guys that really did impress that are probably going to stick around on the active roster. Arthur Malott, who plays in the slot nickel position. I think that's a good depth piece that you want on special teams. And then you also got to throw in guys like Jalen Mills. Got that big interception against Hendon Hooker in the fourth quarter, ultimately led to a scoring drive by Daniel Jackson and Keaton Slovis. So there are some players that probably locked up their spots, but in terms of who this Texans team is, I mean, if you're taking away stuff from a third preseason game where almost 50% waiting for week 1 to roll around, you certainly got some problems on how you feel about your team's chance of going on a deep postseason run into January.
Oh yeah, definitely. We don't need to break down the third string versus third string battles. It is about the practice, and it's about earning those final spots. That's what you're doing there. And there were some observations there on the Lions side too. I'm curious what you saw from the Lions side through either the practices or the game, and who stuck out to you, maybe of those depth pieces, because obviously we didn't see a lot of starters. That's a Campbell hallmark. But who were some of those guys? I know you gave us some guys that you were looking forward to seeing. How did they look to you, and what kind of stuck out to you on the Lions side?
I mean, Kyle Allen has locked up the QB2 spot. That's, I think, a given at this point. Now, remember, this is a guy who is going to be going through a lot of he's going through, a lot of off-season workouts. He's learned a brand new offensive personnel. It's a brand new system for him, but he outplayed Hendon Hooker. He was a more complete quarterback. He was more decisive with the throws. He led the one scoring drive for the offense. So I think that's a positive that you take away in terms of you feel good that he is at least a viable option in the passing attack to be a substantially average quarterback. Isaac Tesla, another guy caught the big 30-yard touchdown pass. He has been phenomenal, and I think everything that Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes wanted from the time that he arrived on the spot. That's something that you could take away as a good wide receiver 4 and a nice complementary piece. Those are really the top 2. You look at the rest of the roster, I think most places are set. The question's going to be on what do you do with the offensive line? What do you do with the running back room? What do you do with the defensive line? But for the majority of the rest of the staff, I think it's abundantly clear. You feel really confident in the addition of what you have with Kyle Allen as your quarterback too. And Isaac Tesla was worth moving up for, giving up future draft compensation, because it seems like that the future is a ride with him having an immediate.
That's music to Lions fans' ears, and even though he has been going against that competition that you're referring to, he's looked good at every stage, whether it's the practices on the practice field, the joint practices, the games, and he's playing everywhere. So he'll be a fun one. I know he'll be a fan favorite too. I'm curious about your perspective on Hooker, because you're an SEC guy, and are you surprised that we never saw more from him? Did you expect more from him coming out of college?
No, it was always a really intriguing conversation when it was Hendon Hooker. And that's not to say even Hendon Hooker could just be any Josh Heupel-led quarterback, just because of the balance of the offensive identity that you have on the playmaking side. Something that we talk a lot about when it comes to the college game versus the NFL game. Who are players that can make the transition to that next level? And unfortunately, Hendon Hooker was one of these guys that played in a very up-tempo, gimmicky offense that was going to be persistent and certainly very consistent at the SEC level and in the college football game, but it never was meant to translate to the NFL. That's always been an issue. That's always been something that's been brought up when it comes to Heupel's past, the way he goes about deciding on how he wants to get his play call designs, and it's been a hindrance towards his quarterback. So Hooker as a third-round pick coming off of a torn ACL was already one of those moves that you felt like was somewhat impressive simply because of where the direction of the program was going. But at the same time, he was already having an upstage battle. He was going to have to learn how to play in a pro-style offense. He was going to have to learn how to play in a more dynamic X, Y, to get to Z kind of formation. And ultimately, it never really sufficed. It led to multiple inconsistencies over the last two off seasons. And now going into year 3 as a 27-year-old backup with 1 year left on his contract, it was evident that he wasn't improving. It was time to move on. And hopefully he can learn for an offense that is a little bit more college style for his future, I think, when it comes to this organization.
The age was really working against him. That was obviously one of the marks when he came in, and Holmes just seems to throw us a little bit of a curve in that third round. He's hit on some big ones in the third round, but it seems like the third and fourth round, kind of those middling picks are the ones where he tends to experiment a little bit more. And Tesla seems to be a hit, even though that was a bit of a reach. But you got your Broderick Martins and Hendon Hookers and a bunch of picks in there. So he always keeps it interesting in the middle rounds. He usually nails the early picks, and then the middle rounds he kind of plays around, and then towards the end, then he seems to get more value.
Again, that's just kind of the nature of the beast. The Texans are an organization that right now has been really trending upward when it comes to the offensive personnel people. You look at the tight end room, you look at the quarterback position, running back room has been pretty sufficient. Nick Caserio doesn't oversplurge when it comes to certain pieces on free agency. He usually finds some ways to be able to let a lot of players walk in the offseason, re-signs them to a cheaper contract or re-signs a replacement for a cheaper contract. But the offensive line has always been one of just the biggest blunders on how you go about addressing an area of weakness that isn't improving. Ariante Ursary has, I think, been better than advertised since joining the team, but he was the 48th overall pick. You do have your questions when it comes to a guy being a mid-second round pick, coming on in and being a immediate plug-and-play franchise left tackle. But we just watched as Kenyon Green. He was traded away this offseason to Philadelphia. He was cut by the Philadelphia Eagles this morning. Just inconsistency after inconsistency. There are some GMs built like that where you just look and say, hey, third round, can't trust it.
Everybody has their tendencies, so it is hard to go against that. And then you have the units that hopefully fill in those gaps, the front offices and everything. But how do you feel about that offensive line going into the season? I mean, it's got some strong names. They're healthier, but do you think they're going to be able to find some synergy and be able to protect Stroud a little bit better this year?
They will be better than what they were last year. It is going to be very hard to be worse, I think is the best way to put it. Not saying that they can't end up being a team that gives up 40 sacks to 45 sacks to maybe 48 sacks. I still think that there are some faults. I still think that there is a ceiling for this organization, but I do feel better about the offensive line. I think that Cole Popovich, who was very well regarded internally by the staff last season, has had some good ideas on how to hide some of the masquerade flaws that come with this team and where the weaknesses on certain spots of the offensive line. I think that there have been some positives when it comes to the transition of some players that you kind of thought were no longer going to be a part of the long-term plan. They may have changed the tune, especially a guy in Titus Howard. It doesn't mean they're going to be a good offensive line. It just means that they're going to be better than what they were a season ago. And if it's better than what it was a season ago, where you went 10-7, 11-6, 12-5, it's a possibility. It's a long shot, but it is a possibility that can get done.
One guy that we haven't talked about yet, and it's kind of funny that we haven't, is one of the main guys they'll be blocking for. It's amazing that with Mixon not being able to start the season, that you're able to fill in a guy like Nick Chubb. I know he's coming off the injury, but you have to imagine with his work ethic and everything, he's going to be ready to go.
He's going to be the starter week 1, and he has looked a lot better in Nick Caley's offense over the last 2 weeks. My question is, what are we going to see from him when you got to get 25 carries a game or even 18 to 19 carries a game? That's going to be something that you can only learn with repetition. You're not going to know in the preseason, because when they're as valuable as players like Nick Chubb, you are going to sit them for a majority of what is a meaningless game on most people's opinion. So I think it's going to be really intriguing to see what is his overall production looking like now that he's going to have extensive reps. How do you feel about Dameon Pierce? How do you feel about Woody Marks, Dare Ogunbowale, 3 other guys that are going to have to mix on in alongside with Chubb? But he has been a good find. The Carolina Panthers game, I think, was a really good setting tone for anybody who had their doubts about Nick Chubb. He averaged 5 yards a play. He also has looked really good during the practice against the Detroit Lions. It didn't seem sluggish. He seemed like he had caught up a little bit more speed. He had picked up the tempo a bit. So a lot to like about where he is. I just need to make sure that you see it a little bit more when the live reps matter. Because, again, this is a player who 2 years ago was an all-pro. He averaged less than 3 yards a play last season in Cleveland behind an offensive line that certainly regressed from 2023, but wasn't the worst in the NFL.
And then you have the questions for the Texans offensive line, but it'll be interesting to watch him and the team overall. I'm curious what you think. You're always very tempered about the Texans, but they're clearly a team on the rise. They've got a similar trajectory to the Lions as far as they're building that young core. They've got the coach, they've got the culture, they've got obviously a younger quarterback. Everything's clicking. What's kind of your expectation for this team this season?
The same as last year. I mean, I don't mean to be boring, Ryan, but the bottom line is that if you don't have an offensive line that is one of the best in the NFL, if you play in a winnable division, you should win games that are in your advantage. And that's what the Texans have right now. They're going to be a team that I think is in every single matchup against weaker opponents. They're going to struggle against the top dogs in the AFC. Now, could maybe they pull off an upset against Buffalo or maybe Kansas City? Perhaps, and it's really going to be based off of what those rosters do more so than what the Texans do. But I think if they're going to be a top 10 defense, maybe even a top 3 defense by when all is said and done, I think they got great depth in the front 7 that really is going to benefit them regarding any injuries that could come up during the regular season. It all comes down to the offensive personnel and how much different this play calling is with Nick Caley. I think it'll be slightly better, which means maybe you get one more win. I think that they're an 11-6 team. They're the most complete team in a very winnable division. They're going to host a playoff game as the number 4 seed like they did last year. They're probably going to be the underdog. They're probably going to get the upset win because that's what the Houston Texans do. And then they're going to face off against the number 1 seed on the road, and you're going to realize why they are the 4 seed and not the number 1 seed. That's basically how I've been feeling about Houston all offseason. It hasn't changed despite some positivity surrounding the offensive line and the offensive play callers.
Well, that I think echoes a sentiment that people would be able to relate to here in Detroit because they've really invested a lot in the trenches here. And that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to be watching for this division, which is going to be one of the tougher divisions in football, because I feel like 3 of the 4 teams continued to invest in the trenches and focus on the trenches, the Lions, the Vikings, and the Bears. The Packers, not as much. So I'm curious if that offensive line is going to be, that situation is going to be similar to what you're describing in Houston. But I'm also curious because you follow all this stuff, you know football very well. I'm curious what you think the projection is for the Lions as somebody that follows this and follows football very well.
I think the Lions on paper still are probably the most complete team in the NFC North. They're not the most complete team in the NFC anymore, but I still think that, again, it's playoff or bust. And they should be able to host a playoff game in that first round. They should feel like that they're in control of their destiny behind a good quarterback in Jared Goff and a solid run game with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs and the weaponry that they have. It's going to be a change because of, again, you no longer have Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn running the show on either side, but there seems to be a lot of confidence in at least the defensive side of things. If you can keep the offense afloat, I believe that you're looking at an 11-6 season at worst, at best, probably 12-5. I think at Minnesota, it's all going to come down to the quarterback when we're talking about Jacob McCarthy, because the rest of the roster is, I think, built to win a Super Bowl right now. It's just, can you trust a young quarterback that came from a run-oriented offense during his time in college? Can he be a Pro Bowl caliber point guard that just elevates the passing attack enough as Sam Darnold did last season? Green Bay, there's going to be some questions when it comes to the overall offensive identity. Can you live with the gunslinger mentality of Jordan Love? How big of a loss is Jair Alexander to this defense? What are going to be some areas of weakness that you know that you're not going to be able to replace? And then Chicago, I think Chicago, once again, I'm in the I wait and see mode, because Chicago wins the offseason every single year. They spend money in the free agency market, and they seem like that they've trended in the right direction. They always seem to be putting themselves in a position where this is where it all comes together. And then it all comes together for 6-11, or 7-10, or we're talking about maybe 8-9, and it's a first-year coach where 8-9 is not a bad thing. It's just what we know the expectations are for that organization that hasn't been able to find its footing in over a decade. I still think that they're going to take another year to get to that level. So I think that, again, Detroit, they're going to be fine. They'll be a playoff team. I do think that the window of them being the team to beat has shut, at least going into 2025. Doesn't mean it can't reopen, but for right now, until we see the actual play calls and the play design and kind of how much we're going to see Dan Campbell's teeth get cut in this matchup, it's hard to envision them as the top team in the NFC.
That's an interesting perspective. So you were saying they're not necessarily the most complete team. Are you talking about because of the coordinators being replaced, or and worried about what that's taken away, or is there a position unit that you're concerned about as well?
I would say probably coordinators. It's a big deal. Like, I think Ohio State right now may be the most complete team in the Big Ten. But if you weren't a fan of the Matt Patricia hire as defense coordinator, and you weren't a fan of the Brian Hartline hire as offense coordinator, you're going to think that until I see it actually in motion, I'm going to have my thoughts, I'm going to have my worries, and going to definitely tend to that with a little bit of trepidation. That's kind of where I am with Detroit. They have all the pieces on paper to be successful. Let's see how two new coordinators are able to adapt to the play design and overall what is going to be a team that still has expectations to be one of the best in the NFL.
This will certainly be a test of kind of the pie chart of what attributions people got from the coaching staff, the players, all of that, because we haven't had this kind of shift in Detroit. Usually we lose coordinators the other way. They just get cut because they're not holding up. So it's a good problem to have, but definitely a different one. And nobody's liking the Matt Patricia hire here in Michigan. So you don't have to worry about people liking that one because he's still not necessarily the favorite son here. But appreciate you coming on, Cole. I know you got to go, but be sure to tell people where they can follow you, and we appreciate you joining the show.
Yeah, everyone, check out my college football content on YouTube at SEC Unfiltered, and if you want to check out any Texans content, kind of to know your enemy or anything about what you could potentially see in a Super Bowl matchup, it's at the Texans Wire, and follow me on Twitter at Mr. Cole Thompson. Definitely follow him. He's got a lot of great information, as you saw in the interviews here. And, hey, who knows what will happen? Maybe we'll see you later on, but hopefully we can talk again soon. Always like having you on the show. Awesome. Appreciate it, Ryan. Take care. Have a good night. You too. Thanks, Cole.
Sports Intel with Ryan Walsh is brought to you by Mary Freebed, Collectible Insurance Services, West Michigan Eye Care Associates, Eric Hall, DDS, Calder Financial Group, Grand Management, Rydan Investments, JH Realty Partners, and Encore Business Group. Sports Intel with Ryan Walsh airs live Monday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern on Jethro.fm.
Stay informed and stay vigilant.